The warning klaxon screamed through the cockpit as Cale Thorne fought desperately with his ship's controls. Red lights bathed everything in an ominous glow, while the tactical display showed multiple system failures cascading across his reconnaissance. Vessel's hull. "Come on, you piece of junk," he growled through gritted teeth, pulling hard on the manual override. The rocky surface of Xerion 7 rushed toward him at a sickening speed, its barren landscape offering no hope for a soft landing. The impact threw him violently against his restraints. Metal shrieked and tore around him as the ship carved a destructive path across the alien moon's surface, finally coming to rest against a cluster of jagged obsidian formations. Smoke filled the cabin as emergency systems flickered and died one by one. Cale hung unconscious in his pilot's seat, blood trickling from a gash above his left eye. His breathing was shallow, ribs likely cracked from the brutal deceleration. The silence that followed was broken only by the occasional groan of settling metal and the distant howl of Xerion 7's perpetual winds. Hours passed before movement stirred in the wreckage's shadow. A figure approached cautiously, weapon drawn, scanning the debris field with predatory awareness. Vera Solis moved like liquid shadow despite her pale blue skin that seemed to glow faintly in the moon's dim light. Her red hair whipped around her shoulders as she circled the crashed vessel, taking in every detail. She had been tracking enemy movement in this sector when the ship screamed overhead, trailing fire and smoke. Protocol demanded she investigate, eliminate any survivors, and report back to her commanders. The war between their species had raged for 3 years, claiming countless lives on both sides. Humans were the enemy. Period. But as she peered through the shattered cockpit canopy, something gave her pause. The unconscious pilot looked younger than she'd expected, his face peaceful despite the blood and bruises. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and she could see his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Alive, but barely. Her weapon remained, trained on him as she considered her options. A quick plasma burst would end it cleanly. No witnesses, no complications. She'd done it before without hesitation. Yet her finger hesitated on the trigger. The pilot stirred, eyes fluttering open to reveal startling green irises. He focused on her gradually, and she saw the moment recognition dawned. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before stopping, realizing the futility. They stared at each other across the wreckage, predator and prey in a tableau of mutual assessment. "Well?" Cale managed hoarsely, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. "This is inconvenient." Vera's lip twitched despite herself. Most humans would be begging for mercy or spitting defiance. This one made observations. "You're dying," she stated matter-of-factly, noting the way he favored his left side and the pallor beneath his tan skin. "Probably," he agreed, then tilted, his head slightly. "You going to help with that? Or just watch?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Vera's training screamed at her to end this now, but something deeper held her back. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her without fear, or maybe just exhaustion from her own failed mission. Her extraction point was 3 days away across hostile terrain, and she was as stranded as he was. "I should kill you," she said finally. "Yes," Cal replied simply. "You should." Their eyes locked for a long moment before Vera slowly lowered her weapon. She couldn't say why, but something about this human intrigued her enough to postpone the inevitable. "Can you walk?" she asked. Kyle tested his limbs carefully, wincing at the sharp protest from his ribs. "If the alternative is dying here, then yes. Good, because we're leaving. Now." The pale blue sun of Xerion 7 cast long shadows across the desolate landscape as Vera and Cale made their way through a maze of crystalline formations. 3 days had passed since the crash, and every step was a negotiation between survival and suspicion. Cale's ribs sent sharp jolts of pain through his torso with each breath, but he refused to slow their pace. His military training had taught him that showing weakness to the enemy was often fatal, even if this particular enemy had chosen to keep him alive for reasons he couldn't fathom. "There." Vera pointed toward a distant ridge with her pale blue finger. "The beacon should be just beyond that formation." Her red hair caught the alien sunlight like flames as she consulted the crude map she'd sketched on a piece of salvaged metal. The emergency beacon was their only hope of rescue, though neither had discussed what would happen when their respective forces arrived. "Assuming it still works," Kyle muttered, adjusting his makeshift splint. He'd fashioned it from debris while Vera kept watch, her weapon never far from reach. "It will work," she replied with the confidence of someone who had no other choice. It has to. They'd barely spoken during their journey, communicating mainly through gestures and necessity. When they'd encountered the sulfur geysers on day 2, they'd worked together wordlessly to find a safe path. When the temperature dropped drastically during the night cycle, they'd shared body heat without acknowledgement, backs pressed together for survival rather than intimacy, but tensions ran deeper than mere distrust. Every few hours, one would catch, the other watching them with calculating eyes, as if measuring threat levels or searching for weakness. The war between their species had taught them that mercy was a luxury neither could afford. "Why?" Kale asked suddenly, breaking the silence as they navigated around a field of razor-sharp crystal shards. "Why what?" Vera didn't look back, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "Why keep me alive? Your people have a shoot-first policy when it comes to humans." Vera was quiet for so long that Kale thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge of uncertainty that surprised them both. "Perhaps I wanted information about human military positions. We both know that's not it." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her unusual pale, blue features arranged in a mask of cold professionalism. But her eyes betrayed something more complex, conflict, perhaps even confusion. "Maybe I just wanted to watch you suffer," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "Try again." Before she could respond, a low growl echoed from somewhere behind them. Both froze, instincts honed by years of combat kicking in immediately. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the skitter of claws on crystal. "Screel. Pack," Vera whispered, recognizing the native predator's call. "At least 3, maybe more." Kyle's hand went to his sidearm, checking the charge level. "Half power, maybe enough for 2 clean shots." "How many can you take?" "Depends how fast you can move with those ribs." The creatures appeared like nightmares given form, 8-legged amalgamations of chitin and fury, each the size of a large dog but infinitely more vicious. Their multiple eyes glowed with predatory hunger as they spread out to flank their prey. Vira's weapon hummed to life, its plasma charge casting purple light across the crystalline landscape. "Stay behind me," she ordered. "Like hell," Kale replied, taking position beside her instead. "We do this together or we die together." She glanced at him, startled by his choice to fight alongside rather than use her as a shield. In that moment of surprise, the Screel attacked. The battle was brutal and brief. Vera's shots were precise, taking down 2 creatures with clean headshots while Kale's more limited firepower managed to wound a third. But the Pax Alpha closed the distance, leaping directly at Vera with claws extended. Without thinking, Kale threw himself between them, taking the creature's claws across his shoulder as he drove his combat knife into its throat. He and the Screel went down in a tangle of limbs and alien blood. "You idiot!" Vera snapped, pulling him away from the dying creature. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Kyle gasped, pressing his hand against the fresh wounds. She stared at him with an expression he couldn't read, her pale features flushed with adrenaline and something else. For a moment, the careful distance between them evaporated, replaced by something raw and immediate. "I don't understand you," she said quietly, her fingers hovering uncertainly over his injured shoulder. "Join the club," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I don't understand me either right now." The admission hung in the air between them as she began, tending to his wounds with supplies from his emergency kit. Her touch was gentle despite her obvious frustration, and Kyle found himself studying the way concentration creased her unusual features. "We should keep moving," Vera said eventually, though neither made any immediate effort to do so. "Yeah," Kyle agreed. "We should." But something had shifted during the fight. Some fundamental barrier had cracked. As they resumed their journey toward the beacon, the silence between them felt different, less hostile, more uncertain, more dangerous. The storm hit without warning, turning Xerion 7's already hostile landscape into a nightmare of howling winds and crystalline debris. Vera grabbed Kale's arm, pulling him toward the dark mouth of a cave she'd spotted among the ancient ruins scattered across the ridge. "In here," she shouted over the screaming wind, her red hair whipping around her face like flames. They stumbled into the shelter just as the storm reached its full fury. The cave entrance was partially blocked by fallen stone, but it provided blessed relief from the razor-sharp crystal fragments that the wind hurled like bullets across the landscape outside. Kale collapsed against the cave wall, breathing heavily. The wound on his shoulder had reopened during their desperate sprint to safety, and dark stains spread across his torn shirt. His face was pale, shiny with sweat despite the dropping temperature. "Let me see," Vera said, moving toward him with her medical supplies. "I'm fine," he protested automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're bleeding again, and your skin is burning up." She knelt beside him, her pale blue fingers cool against his fevered forehead. "Infection, probably. From the Skrill claws, we need to treat this properly." The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, its walls covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light from Vera's emergency beacon. Ancient alien architecture curved overhead, speaking of a civilization long dead. As Vera worked to clean his wounds, Kale's fevered mind began to wander. The pain medication she'd given him was strong, designed for her species' physiology, and it loosened the rigid control he usually maintained over his thoughts and words. "My sister would have liked you," he said suddenly, his voice soft and distant. Vera's, hand stilled on his shoulder. "Your sister?" "Elena. She was a medic, always patching people up, trying to save everyone." His eyes focused on something beyond the cave walls. "She died in the Proxima raid. Your people's bombing run caught her field hospital." The words hung in the air like an accusation, but Kyle's tone held no anger, only exhaustion and grief. Vera's jaw tightened, her own memories stirring. "I lost someone too," she said quietly, resuming her work on his wounds. "My brother Dex. He was barely 18 when your fleet hit our colony ship. Civilian transport full of families trying to evacuate." They sat in silence as the storm raged outside, each lost in their own painful memories. The divide between their species suddenly felt both infinite and meaningless. Grief was grief, loss was loss, regardless of the color of one's skin or the shape of one's home world. "Why are we doing this?" Kale asked, his fever-bright eyes finding hers. "This war, this endless killing, what's the point?" "I don't know anymore," Vera admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I used to think I knew. Used to think humans were monsters that we were fighting for survival. But you—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "But I what?" "You threw yourself between me and that Skrill," she said, her pale features troubled. "You could have let it kill me. Should have, by everything we've been taught. But you didn't." Kyle studied her face in the flickering light. Her red hair had come loose from its practical braid, framing her unusual features in soft waves. There was something almost ethereal about her appearance, but her eyes held depths of pain and conflict that were utterly human in their intensity. "Maybe we're both just tired of being what this war wants us to be," he said. The medication was making him drowsy, his injured body demanding rest. As his eyes grew heavy, he felt Vera shift beside him, checking his temperature again. "Don't move," she said softly, her voice carrying a note he'd never heard before. He thought she was going to examine his wounds again, but instead she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his forehead. The gesture was tender, almost reverent and completely unexpected. "You foolish human," she whispered against his skin. "You never stopped trying to protect me, even when I should have been your enemy." Kale's eyes opened, finding hers in the dim light. The careful distance they'd maintained for days had evaporated completely, replaced by something raw and immediate. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow in the cave's shadows, and her breath was warm against his face. "Vera," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I know," she replied, understanding what he couldn't put into words. "I know." She settled beside him, her shoulder touching his uninjured one. For the first time since the crash, neither of them reached for their weapons. The storm outside continued its assault on the landscape, but inside their shelter something else was taking root. "When this is over," Cale said quietly, "when we reach the beacon—" "I know," she repeated, and this time there was sadness in her voice. "We'll be enemies again." "Will we?" She turned to look at him, her unusual features soft in the emergency. "Beacons glow. I don't know how to be anything else. Maybe we could learn." The possibility hung between them like a fragile flame, too precious to examine too closely. As Cale's fever finally broke and exhaustion claimed him, Vera remained awake, watching over him with thoughts she couldn't quite name. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, but inside the cave, something fundamental had shifted. The war between their species continued to rage across the galaxy, but here, in this moment, it felt very far away. When morning came, they would have to resume their journey to the beacon. They would have to face the reality of rescue and separation. But for now, in the ancient quiet of the cave, they simply existed together. Two souls who had found something unexpected in the midst of endless conflict, something that might just be worth fighting for. The emergency beacon sat like a broken promise among the twisted metal remains of an old research station. Its transmission array had been damaged by years of exposure to Xerion 7's harsh environment, leaving vital components scattered across the rocky ground. "How long?" Cale asked, watching Vera examine the device with practiced efficiency. 2 days, maybe 3, she replied, her pale blue fingers tracing the damaged circuits. "The core transmitter is intact, but we'll need to rebuild the signal. Amplifier from scratch." They'd been working in careful synchronization since arriving at the beacon site that morning, their movements coordinated by an unspoken understanding that had developed over their days together. The awkwardness following their intimate moment in the cave had gradually given way to something deeper, a connection that neither could quite name, but both were reluctant to examine too closely. As the alien sun reached its zenith, they took shelter in the research station's partially intact main building. The structure provided blessed relief from the heat and wind, its thick walls decorated with faded star charts and research notes in multiple languages. "Human and Catherian joint research," Vera observed, studying the wall displays. "Before the war. We worked together once," Cale said, settling beside her on a makeshift bench. His injuries had healed considerably, but he still favored his left side. Hard to imagine now. Vera's eyes lingered on a photograph showing mixed crews of humans, and her people, Catherians, working side by side in some long-abandoned laboratory. Their expressions were animated, collaborative, full of shared purpose. "My father was part of the cultural exchange program," she said suddenly. "He spent 2 years on New Geneva, learning human agricultural techniques. He used to tell me stories about human children who would visit the research gardens, how fascinated they were by our bioluminescent crops. What changed his mind about us?" Her expression darkened. "The Kepler station incident. When your military claimed our research vessel was carrying weapons and destroyed it. 300 civilians died, including his best friend. They'd been dancing around these conversations for days, the personal losses, the political betrayals, the cascade of violence that had led to open war. But now, with rescue approaching and time running short, the words came easier. I lost my first unit to a Catherian ambush on Titan 7, Cale said quietly. 12 good soldiers, people I'd trained with for years. For a long time, I thought every Catherian was a monster. And now? He turned to study her profile, the way afternoon light played across her unusual features. Now I think maybe we're all just people caught in something bigger than ourselves. Vera met his gaze, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. They'd been carefully avoiding physical contact since the cave, but now she reached out and traced a finger along the healing wound on his shoulder. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore," he replied, though they both knew he wasn't just talking about the injury. Her hand lingered on his skin, and he covered it with his own. The simple contact sent electricity through both of them, a recognition of something that had been building since their first confrontation in the wreckage of his ship. "Kale," she said, his name soft on her lips. "I know," he replied, echoing her words from the cave. "This is impossible. Completely impossible," she agreed, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was tentative, uncertain, like two people discovering fire for the first time. But as her lips parted under his, uncertainty gave way to hunger. The afternoon dissolved into a blur of desperate passion. They came together with the intensity of people who knew their time was limited, each touch and caress carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say aloud. Her pale blue skin was warm under his hands, and she gasped his name as he traced patterns across her shoulders and down her arms. "We shouldn't," she whispered against his throat, even as her hands worked at the fastenings of his shirt. "No," he agreed, his voice rough with desire. "We shouldn't." But they couldn't stop. The war, their respective duties, the impossibility of their situation, none of it mattered in the face of what they felt for each other. They made love with a fierce tenderness that spoke of desperate need and profound connection, their bodies moving together in perfect synchronization. Afterward, they lay entwined on the research station's worn floor. Vera's red hair spread across Kyle's chest like liquid fire. The alien sun was setting, painting the walls in shades of purple and gold. "What happens when they come for us?" she asked, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin. "I don't know," he admitted. "Command won't understand. They'll say you compromised me, that I can't be trusted. My people will say the same. Fraternizing with the enemy is treason." They lay in silence, the weight of reality settling around them like a shroud. Tomorrow, they would complete repairs on the beacon. Within days, rescue ships would arrive, and, with them, the end of this impossible interlude. "Run away with me," Kyle said suddenly, the words surprising them both. Vera lifted her head to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" "Run away with me," he repeated, more certain now. "We could disappear, find some neutral world where no one knows us, start over." "Kale, we can't." "Why not?" He sat up, pulling her with him. "What do we owe them? What do we owe this? Or that's taken everything from both of us?" She wanted to say yes, he could see it in her eyes, the desperate longing for a different kind of life. But years of military discipline warred with her heart. "Our people need us," she said finally. "The war will go on with or without us," he finished. "But this, what we have, this might be the only real thing either of us has ever found." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, as if she could memorize the taste of him. When they broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Ask me again tomorrow," she whispered, "after we send the signal." "I will," he promised. "And I'll keep asking until you say yes." As night fell around them, they held each other close, both knowing that morning would bring choices that would define the rest of their lives. The beacon sat silent in the darkness, waiting to carry their signal across the void, a signal that would either separate them forever or give them the chance to forge something new. The beacon's repaired transmitter hummed to life as dawn broke over Xerion 7, its signal piercing the void with mechanical precision. Kale and Vera stood side by side, watching the status lights confirm successful transmission to both human and Catherian monitoring stations. 12 hours, Vera said quietly, checking her calculations. "Maybe less." 12 hours, Kale repeated, the words heavy with finality. They'd spent the night in each other's arms, alternating between desperate passion and quiet conversation about impossible futures. Now, in the harsh light of morning, reality pressed down on them like the weight of distant stars. The first ships appeared as silver specks against the pale blue sky, a human destroyer and a Catherian cruiser, arriving within minutes of each other. Both vessels moved with the predatory grace of warships, weapon systems undoubtedly powered and ready. "They'll demand explanations," Vera said, her hand finding his. "Let them," Kale replied, squeezing her fingers. "I know what I'm going to tell them." The landing craft touched down simultaneously on opposite sides of the research station, disgorging armed soldiers who immediately took defensive positions. The human squad was led by Commander Torres, a hard-faced woman Kale recognized from joint operations briefings. The Catherian force was commanded by someone Vera clearly knew, a tall, austere figure whose pale blue skin was marked with the ritual scars of elite units. "Captain Thorne," Torres called out, her weapon lowered but ready. "Step away from the hostile and report." "Pilot Solace," the Catherian commander's voice carried across the clearing in their musical language. "Explain your association with this human." Kale and Vera exchanged a look, then stepped forward together instead of apart. The simple act of defiance sent ripples of tension through both groups of soldiers. "Commander Torres," Kale said formally, "I'm submitting my resignation from active duty, effective immediately." "The hell you are," Torres snapped. "You're clearly suffering from some form of psychological compromise. Medical will sort you out once we're back on ship." "Sub-Commander Vex," Vera addressed her superior in accented but clear standard, "I formally request a discharge from military service." Catherian officer's expression darkened. "You will return to the ship for debriefing and disciplinary action. Your behavior here constitutes treason." "No," Vera said simply, "it constitutes choice." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a collapsing star. Torres raised her weapon, targeting Vera. Vex did likewise, aiming at Kale. Both groups of soldiers followed their commander's lead, creating a deadly standoff in the shadow of the ancient research station. "Stand down, Captain," Torres ordered. "That's a direct command." "I can't do that," Kale replied, moving protectively in front of Vera. "Then you're both traitors," Vex declared, his weapon charging with an ominous whine. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, broken only by the whisper of wind across crystalline rock. Kale could feel Vera's hand on his back, steady and warm despite the weapons trained on them. "Wait," a new voice cut through the tension. A figure emerged from the human landing craft, Admiral Chen, whose reputation for pragmatism was legendary throughout the fleet. She was followed by a Catherian in diplomatic robes, someone whose presence made Vex immediately lower his weapon in respectful acknowledgement. "Stand down, all of you," Admiral Chen ordered. "Ambassador Thel and I need to hear this story properly." What followed was the strangest debriefing either Kale or Vera had ever experienced. They spoke honestly about their time together, the gradual shift from enemies to allies to something more. They described their growing understanding that the war was consuming both species, leaving nothing but grief and rage in its wake. "You're talking about desertion," Commander Torres said flatly. "We're talking about peace," Vera replied. "About the possibility that individual connections might be stronger than institutional hatred." Ambassador Thel, an elderly Catherian, with intricate ceremonial markings, studied them both with ancient eyes. "And you believe your attachment represents something significant?" "I believe it represents hope," Kale said, "for both our species." The discussion that followed was heated, complex, and ultimately unprecedented. Two enemy soldiers requesting asylum from their own forces, claiming their bond could serve as a bridge between warring civilizations. It should have been dismissed as romantic fantasy. But Admiral Chen was a student of history, and she recognized symbols when she saw them. The image of human and Catherian standing together, choosing love over loyalty, would resonate across the galaxy. Sometimes wars needed heroes. Sometimes they needed something more. They needed hope. "There's a neutral trading post on Kepler 5, the Admiral said finally. "Independent territory outside both governments' jurisdiction. If you could somehow reach it." "We could," Kale said immediately. "My ship has enough range." What ship? Torres demanded. Your vessel was destroyed in the crash. Admiral Chen smiled slightly. The research station has a functioning scout craft in its lower bay. Amazing what you find when you look carefully. The next few hours passed in a blur of negotiations, threats, and careful diplomatic language. In the end, it was Ambassador Thel who provided the crucial support, speaking of ancient Catherian prophecies about bridges between stars. As the alien sun set for what might be the last time, Kale and Vera prepared to depart in the small scout ship. Both rescue forces had withdrawn to their vessels, maintaining the fiction that the escaped prisoners had somehow overpowered their guards. Are you sure? Kyle asked as they ran through the pre-flight checklist. Once we do this, there's no going back. Vera looked at him across the cramped cockpit, her pale blue features serene despite everything they were leaving behind. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The scout ship lifted off smoothly, climbing through Zarian 7's thin atmosphere toward the star-scattered void beyond. Behind them, the military vessels maintained careful distance, allowing their escaped prisoners to disappear into hyperspace. Epilogue. 3 years later, the small cafe on Kepler 5 had become something of a legend among traders and travelers. Run by an unusual couple, a human man and a Catherian woman, it served as neutral ground where people from all species could meet and talk. More importantly, it had become an unofficial embassy for peace negotiations. Delegations from both sides occasionally met there, drawn by the symbolic power of its owner's story. The war continued, but cracks were beginning to show. Voices on. Both sides were asking whether love might be stronger than hatred after all. Kale looked up from the morning receipts to see Vera arranging flowers in the cafe's front window. Bioluminescent Catherian blooms that glowed softly in the morning. Light. Her red hair was longer now, and she wore the flowing robes of Kepler 5's multicultural fashion. Any regrets? He asked, the same question he'd posed every morning for 3 years. Only that it took us so long to find each other, she replied, the same answer she'd given every time. Outside, the spaceport bustled with activity from a dozen different species. Ships came and went carrying news from across the galaxy. Some brought word of battles and losses. Others spoke of growing peace movements, of soldiers laying down arms, of lovers choosing hope over hatred. Kyle and Vera had become more than just survivors of a crash on a desolate moon. They had become proof that even in the darkest times, two hearts could find each other and choose to build something beautiful together. Their love story had indeed become a symbol, not just of peace between species, but of the fundamental truth that connection transcends conflict, that understanding grows from proximity, and that sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply choosing to love instead of hate. As the morning sun climbed higher over Kepler 5, casting rainbow patterns through the cafe's crystal wind chimes, Kale and Vera began preparing for another day of serving both coffee and hope to a galaxy slowly learning that differences could be bridges rather than walls. Their war was over, their real life had just begun.